Et nos amours, faut-il qu'ils m'en souviennent?
Welcome to The Thing About France, a podcast where American cultural figures explore the fascinating and complicated relationship between France and America. I'm Bénédicte de Montlore, and this is The Thing About France. The amazing thing about Adam Gopnik is that he knows more about France than many French people I know. It's as if this podcast was made for him. You know, you can ask him any question, from the Statue of Liberty to French pop music. He will give you an eloquent, informative, and captivating answer. He in fact arrived at the embassy on Fifth Avenue, where we had just begun major renovations. We basically met in a storage room between two cabinets and a sofa propped on its side. Let's say this added to the informal nature of the conversation. We talked about the intellectual exchanges between France and America, the role of presidents in both countries, Montaigne, Romain Gary, and Bastille Day. Allez, c'est parti. So, hello, Adam Gopnik.
Hello, Bénédicte.
Welcome to The Thing About France.
Well, it's wonderful to be here. The Thing About France has been my lifeblood for 20 years, more than that, 30 years, so I'm delighted to be here.
Exactly. This is exactly why I wanted to have you on our podcast, because I think you're the most important American intellectual writing about France. Like, you've been a staff writer at The New Yorker for over 30 years. But I cannot really think of a French subject that you've not touched upon. You've written about French literature, you've written about French food, and maybe I wanted to start by, in fact, a passage from your most recent book, 1,000 Small Sanities, The Moral Adventure of Liberalism. And there is a very beautiful passage where you explain that it's so interesting that the first things that immigrants saw when they arrived in America, and so they considered it the first American thing they saw, was in fact a French thing, the Statue of Liberty.
Yes, I think that's one of the most beautiful and surprisingly little-known stories about the great Franco-American adventure. My grandparents, the first thing they saw coming to America was the Statue of Liberty. At the end of the American Civil War, a group of Republicans, in the French sense, in France, said we should construct a giant statue of Liberty as a liberated slave with a shackle struck off her foot, and make it as a present, as a celebration of the triumph of the Republican ideal. So I think that story about the statue as being the image of liberty and of liberalism, republicanism, that connects America and France is one of my favorites.
Yeah, and it's also a symbol of the intellectual connection between France and America, which has been always so strong. Like in this recent book you published, you try to explain, in fact, to your daughter what is liberalism and why is it so important. And you start by quoting Montaigne as one of the fathers of this idea. And there is one sentence I really liked in this book when you say, Montaigne, the essayist, understood how divided we are as human beings, and that meant we had to base our social behavior on compassion, skepticism, and uncertainty rather than dogma, justice, and utopianism. And so I love the fact that you start so far in history to describe this connection between France and America and this intellectual connection. So how would you describe, this is very broad, but how do you describe the intellectual connection between France and America?
Well, in so many ways, that connection is the lifeblood, the spark, the engine spark of American life, with all of the differences, linguistic differences and cultural differences between America and France. The intellectual exchange between France and America is, I think, far more vivid historically and lively than the exchange between America and Britain. With all of the great British figures that we have, the French in lots of ways matter more. You know, we think obviously about the way that the Enlightenment and the ideals of the Enlightenment were only sporadically realized in France, and in certain ways were more fully realized in America and by the American Revolution. And for me, Montaigne articulates it not in a political context, because Montaigne wasn't thinking in classic political terms at all. He's not Montesquieu. He was thinking, what are human beings really like, and what does that tell us about the way they conduct themselves? And he was the first to say clearly, look, we are imperfect, and we will always be imperfect. And the societies we build will always be imperfect, and we'll always have to live with our divided natures. And therefore, in the famous, beautiful essay on the wounded stag, he says, what do we have? He said, we have empathy, what we would call empathy now. We have sympathy for the suffering of others. And the foundational ethical and moral impulse we should have is sympathy for the suffering of others. So for me, that's the kind of humanism that has to precede liberalism. And France, you asked me a moment ago, to characterize the overall shape of the exchange between the two countries, is that France, though in many ways, as I think we both would agree, having a very tragic political history, has always had a reservoir of a kind of living humanism that has again and again come to America to enliven, to, in a simple word, to humanize our thought. Take another instance from history. When Albert Camus came to America in 1947, his impact here was absolutely overwhelming, because he seemed to show a way forward. He seemed to show a way in which you could be what we would call a liberal, a Republican, deeply believing in Republican values, but that need not be a philosophically impoverished way to be. The fullness of Camus' humanity, his ability to see without blinking the entire tragic side of human existence, all of those things totally revolutionized the sensibility of a generation. Camus' example did.
And do you think of other thinkers or French intellectuals who have an influence today?
Well, certainly, American academia could not proceed without the French post-structuralists. Most of the critique of the Enlightenment comes out of Foucault. Most of the habits of reading skeptically come from Jacques Derrida, who I was lucky enough to know a bit. Certainly, Roland Barthes has been one of the greatest influences on my own writing and on generations. So certainly, French intellect has never ceased to be of primary importance in America.
And among our contemporaries, if they are other intellectuals you admire?
Oh, absolutely. I was lucky enough to know André Glucksmann. Glucksmann is a perfect example of Montaigne's kind of humanism. As you know, André, as I was lucky enough to call him, began his political life as a Maoist, as on the extreme left in 1968, and then through his own openness to experience and his awareness of human fallibility, his exposure to Solzhenitsyn, but even more his exposure to the full range of witness from the totalitarian countries, evolved for himself a very powerful philosophy, which was based exactly in the idea that the bon, that the good is unknown to us, but le mal, the evil, is easily known to us. We all know what wrong looks like. We all know what cruelty looks like. And so he evolved a very powerful, humanistic, and very activist ethic. So Glucksmann was one person who had an enormous effect on my own inner life. My good friend, Bernard-Henri Lévy, with whom I've often, countless times, have debated and had conversations. And the thing that makes Bernard so irresistible to me, and the reason I admire him so much, is I don't know anyone who combines common sense and courage to such a degree. I know there's a quixotic side to Bernard, literally, that he's a Don Quixote-like figure in many eyes. We don't always agree about foreign policy or political action, but agreeing with the people you admire is not the reason you admire them. You don't admire them because you agree with them. You admire them because they give you an example of the power of courage or of clear thinking in the world, and Bernard does that for me all the time.
And in the opposite direction, there are a lot of American intellectuals who are influential in France. Like, for instance, gender studies is an obvious example. Like, it had a huge influence in France. I'm always stricken to see that many Americans who are very famous in France are less famous here than they are in France, and vice versa. Like, for example, Gloria Steinem. She's a household name here.
Yes.
In French, it's only recently that her books were published, but on the opposite direction, Paul Auster is a star in France.
Huge, superstar.
Bob Wilson is a superstar in France. So it's always a bit unpredictable who is going to cross the Atlantic.
It's always something that fascinates me. Jerome Charon, for instance, superstar in France, much well-respected writer here, but not a writer, not a supernova here. And I've always been fascinated by what that chemistry is that does it. I think, at the risk of indulging in a bit of a stereotype, I think that French readers react to American writers who seem very American to them.
The same way as American readers react to French writers who are extremely French.
Yes.
They love Welbeck,
exactly,
for instance. But if you have a writer who tries to write a novel about America, even though it's very successful in France, then Americans don't like it because it sounds fake.
No.
So, but Welbeck is like their favorite because they think it's so French.
French, exactly.
You've written about him, in fact.
I have, yes, I write about him in this book. Well, Welbeck fascinates me. I think I can honestly say that I wrote the first piece in English about his work because I was fascinated by what he represented, by the response he was getting in France. And I have a great regard for his, how can I put this, the integrity of his intellect. He's a satirist, and he does what all satirists do. He says, if this trend continues to develop, this way of thinking about the world, what would the consequences be? So I admire to use a extreme example, but a good one, his vision in the Elementary Particles of the connection between libertinism, wild sexual freedom, and liberalism in the French sense was quite shocking. If you remember, it's very, very vivid. But then we had the Dominique Strauss-Kahn incident, and you had to say, kind of an interesting novelistic thing that somebody who's the head of the World Bank, of the IMF, would also have an insatiable sexual appetite. I think that, like all the great satirists, Welbeck puts his finger on realities before the rest of us see them. That fascinates me. The idea that there are literary values that are independent of political values is a very powerful one in France too. So that one could admire Céline or Genet or Dreux-Le Rochelle or any number of writers whose politics, anti-Semitism, we might find abhorrent, but that we recognize that as writers, as literature, their work has value, has vision. I think that's a huge, that coming back to our foundational theme, the humanism of Montaigne, that's what we mean about being divided. We can admire someone enormously as a writer, or Paul Morand, as a writer or a poet, and at the same time decry their politics. We don't have to make unitary judgments about the world. And I always find that one of the things I love about French intellectual life is the absence of the unitary judgment.
One other writer that you've written about is Romain Gary.
Ah, yes.
And he's a favorite of diplomats. He's a
right.
war hero who turned diplomat. So he was our consul general in Los Angeles. Apparently in the diplomatic corps, he didn't have such a great reputation. But on the literary side, he's an icon because he won twice the Goncourt Prize, our most important...
The Nobel Prize of France.
Yes, the Nobel Prize of French literature. And usually you cannot get it twice because it's forbidden. But the thing he did was that he won it twice under two different names. So once for The Roots of Heaven, Les Racines du Ciel, and another time under his pen name Émile Ajar for The Life Before Us.
Yes.
But he's so French. Even though he was married to Jean Seberg, even though he lived in the US, he's not that well known here. So what drew you to him?
Oh, I love the figure of Romain Gary. He's an irresistible figure. And of course, he is the most French of Frenchmen who was not French at all. He was a poor Jewish kid from the Eastern countries. His mother struggled to turn him into a French gentleman because those were, as he said once, not even General de Gaulle had as high an opinion of France as my mother did. His mother had never been in France, or very briefly.
And this is my favorite book. The Promise of Dawn is my favorite book.
It's a wonderful book. And
about maternal love.
Yes, about maternal love, about the wildness of his mother's dream. It's also hilarious, if I might say, about adolescent sexual discovery. And it's a wonderful book. And I admire Gary so much because he's a truly self-invented man, You
call him a great big liar.
And all three things are important. He was a very big liar. He lied about everything, and he was completely great. And the scale of his fictions were not to belittle others, but to enlarge a view of life. So yes, Gary means an enormous amount to me.
You know how much we love literature on The Thing About France. So we had to mention a great new podcast by our friends at the Brooklyn Public Library. It's called Borrowed, and it's a narrative podcast that starts at the library and takes you somewhere new. On it, you hear stories from people across the neighborhood. A patron who got his high school diploma at age 70, teenagers, environmental activists, drag queens reading books to kids, and so much more. That's Borrowed from Brooklyn Public Library. Find it wherever you get your podcasts. You've lived in Paris, you were an American in Paris, but not only that, you're kind of the specialist of the Americans in Paris. You even edited
an anthology,
Americans in Paris, which talks about Emerson, Fitzgerald, Edith Wharton, Elizabeth Bishop, James Baldwin,
Henry James.
So, what is the draw for Americans to live in Paris, and how did it evolve? Like, you think living in Paris today would be very different from your experience 20 years ago?
Yes and no. How's that for a good humanist answer? What draw, the love affair of Americans for France, of course, is real, but the love affair of Americans, and particularly of American writers for Paris, is overwhelming. I think that two things I think are true. One is that this distance between America and Paris is large enough to demand a journey. In other words, when you decide to go to Paris, even to this day, that's a commitment in the 19th century, it was a commitment of months. But even now, we don't go casually on the plane to Paris. But more than that, I think that Americans, it's in the American Constitution that we have a right to the pursuit of happiness. And Americans identify Paris with the pursuit of happiness. They do it in very corny ways, in corny romantic comedies. They do it in very heightened ways, in the literature of Hemingway or Fitzgerald. But we do identify Paris with an idea of happiness. One of the reasons why Paris is such a seductive place for Americans is because, Paris itself is structured by this remarkable dialogue between the insane discipline of French life and the hedonism of French civilization. It's one of the things you had to live it. Now, would it be different now? And then, of course, Paris is always changing and always is in countless different ways. I was one of those people who thought in '98 that the first victory in the World Cup would be a key moment of opening that door, and the door opened less widely than many of us had thought. But I'm always impressed more and more each time I'm in Paris with the integration of Maghrébia into the larger French whole. It's one of the things we always forget about Camus is that he's an Algerian writer. I'm sure French people don't forget about it, but Americans forget about it too. So my fears for France are very real, as are my fears for America. But nothing really adulterates my love of Paris.
And what is your Proustian Madeleine? What is the thing you smell or you see that brings you back or you hear that brings you back to Paris?
And we all know the phenomenon of amnesia, right? Of forgetting, of not being able to remember. There's a complementary ailment which we could call hypermnesia, which is remembering too much. And for me, the Luxembourg Gardens are the site of a massive hypermnesia. I can't walk in there anymore because both of my kids, particularly my son Luke, was a baby there. Baby and then a child came of age.
Yeah, you write a lot in Paris
about that because my day was organized. I would write from 9 in the morning until 4 in the afternoon, and then Luke would be out of school or be free. And I would put him in his poussette and we would go to the playground in Luxembourg Gardens. It was a few blocks away. It was a wonderful walk. It was a very beautiful routine. And I would sit and read Le Monde while I kind of watched him out of the corner of an eye. It's a very beautiful routine that made me feel very, in that odd way that expatriates are, at once isolated and integrated. I was integrated into the life of the playground, at the same time isolated as an American. And the great moment finally came when Luke was little, when we went to, there's the famous marionette show, the Guignol, that's right by there too. So for me, that's my Madeleine. That's the place. I cannot walk into the Luxembourg Gardens without tearing up.
I feel in your writing about France and about life in France, sometimes there is a paradox. Like you write about the sense of loneliness and at the same time the great sense of friendship.
Yes.
So you say there is nothing sadder, but at the same time, no more representative picture of the American in Paris than the image of Henry James when he was walking back to his chilly apartment. So there is a loneliness. I don't know if you experience it. And at the same time, you write about this sense of friendship, and you even say that it's particularly intense, like almost impossible for Americans to attain. So, like, for you, is it a paradox or not at all? It goes together.
No. Like most things in life, it's a tension between two states, which is where we live. It's a contradiction, but we live in contradictions. But I always was struck by that. Friendship in France is a great gift of intimacy. And one of the things in New York, and America generally, and certainly in New York, friendship is a much more haphazard occasion.
Yeah, I was interested by that because I've been an expatriate for a long time in New York, and in fact I've made a lot of American friends, but lots of French person in New York say it's impossible to become friends with Americans
because they don't have any time
about that.
Yes, they have no time. Americans imagine if you see somebody for dinner once every 6 months, we're good friends. When you have a friendship in France, it means you check in during the day. It means you're available at night if someone is suffering. It's a deeper kind of commitment. The other thing I'd say, my experience of Paris was it was always organized around cohorts, academic cohorts particularly, people who would come of age together.
Exactly. It all dates back to when you were a student.
Yes, what your promotion was is sort of the core clan that you'll take through life. And I always used to feel that about when I would spend time with the 68, that even if they were at war with each other, they were connected in a way that I was friends with many, I would never be connected to any. And so, it's something I'm often haunted by, honestly, Benedict, because Martha, my wife, and I, who sometimes look at each other and said, we should have stayed in Paris.
Yeah, I was going to ask you this question. Like, listening to you, you wonder, why did you leave Paris?
So it was in part because Martha said to me memorably, and I used this in the book, in Paris the Moon, she said, in Paris we have a beautiful existence but not a full life. In New York we have a full life but not a beautiful existence. So we were choosing between beautiful existence and full life. And also, and I'll say this was very direct, staring us in the face. We had to decide whether Luke was going to go on, our older child, in French school or come back to America and go to a progressive school here. And I was torn then, I'm torn today. There's so much to be said for the French educational system. It's rigor, it's high standards, it's refusal to compromise. And as you know, kids who come out of that system come out well educated. On the other hand, you suffer a lot in the course of that education. So we made the decision, we'd rather have them go to an American progressive school.
So do you still, I know you love French food, do you still go to a lot of French restaurants here?
The truth is I love to cook, and I love to cook at home. But my own cooking now, like a lot of the great cooking in France, actually, has been very influenced by Thai cooking and by all of those kinds of wonderful Eastern flavors. But that's true, as I say, in France now, too. So much of the best cooking.
It evolved a lot.
Yes.
Like you even have French chefs like Alain Passat who cook only with vegetables.
Vegetables, yes.
Which seems very anti-French.
Very anti-French. And in fact,
I
actually cooked in Passard's kitchen. I chopped onions. They were going to let me cook anything. I'm always torn because when we're in Paris, one part of me thinks we must go and discover and celebrate all the new flavors and the new approach. But the truth is I want to go back to the old places and eat poulet frites. And we love Chez Georges. We love Chez René down the boulevard. Love Chez André in the 8th. The last meal I had with Kirk was there.
So you have a thing for the Chez somebody.
I don't know why. It's something
Chez Georges, Chez René, and Chez André.
I love the Bistro de Paris. Of course, we still go back to the Balzar. For me, it's funny because I have a reputation for being, gastronomic and all that too. And I love to cook and I love to eat. But I'm not really a fussy eater that way. I like the elevation of a meal.
So why did you write a book about cooking and French and
I wrote
table?
I wrote a book
art of eating.
About the table, not the kitchen. That was what I was trying to define in that book. This is a book called The Table Comes First, because that, for me, is the truth of it. Is I love the community of dinner, the community of the table.
And you like to say that the French invented the restaurant, which
yes.
is the way to share a meal,
exactly.
but not at home.
But not at home,
it's
exactly.
easier.
It's why I love restaurants and why I love restaurant culture in that way.
And I know one of the things I really like about your writing is that you can talk so eloquently about food, but then your next article is about politics. And I've noticed that you have also a passion for French presidents.
I've written about
you've written about almost all of them, like about De Gaulle and about Pompidou. And
I've written De Gaulle, Pompidou. I don't think I've ever written about Giscard d'Estaing.
You missed this one.
Yes.
And you write a lot about
Mitterrand.
And you wrote a lot about Macron.
Yes.
And so I was in Sarkozy, obviously. So I was interested to get your views on that. Like, do you think the idea of the president is completely different in France and America because there is such an important influence of our monarchical legacy and Napoleonic era? Like, how would you describe for an American audience the difference of a French president and the role of an American president?
That's such a good question. And of course, in America, we always think of the presidency as being ennobled and elevated. But that role of the American president is nothing compared to the monarchical expectations I think the French still have about the president. The president is meant to be a monarch, not in terms of the absolutism of his powers, but in terms of the dignity of his self-presentation, or if it ever were to happen, her self-presentation. And I think that it was astounding to me. We were in Paris when it happened, that Sarkozy's presidency ended on the night he was elected, because he went to Fouquet and he looked like President Bling Bling, and he failed to conduct himself with the dignity appropriate to the president of France. And he never really recovered from that loss of monarchical
you
splendor.
think the fact that he was jogging a lot?
Yes, and then
because this was considered in France very American. They even called him Sarkozy the American.
Yes, is that French people like Americans on their own terms, right? They like a little bit of American informality. They like daring, the audacity, and all that too. But they don't like the vulgarity. French people don't like vulgarity in a public figure. Americans can take it fine. So yes, and it's one of the reasons why Mitterrand, with all of his grave flaws and faults, but he certainly inhabited that role in a deeply satisfying way. Some
people say he's the last one of this kind. So what is a president today?
Well, I had high hopes. I still have. I think Macron had the right idea of what his role would be. It's why he talked about Jupiter and went to Versailles. He's a technocrat at heart, and as was Giscard d'Estaing. Technocrats are not natural monarchs in that way. They're very good leaders often, or very good executives, maybe. But clearly, in a sense, Mitterrand was the last to occupy that role. There was a very interesting book making the good case. It's a history of the Fifth Republic. Makes a very good case that the fatal flaw, the Achilles heel of the Fifth Republic, was always the reality that the role of the president was so excessive, was so prominent, that the only real alternative to presidential power would be the power of the street. That the legislature, even when it had official power, never had sufficient symbolic power. And so that by making the role of the president so overstressed, de Gaulle was setting up the country for 68 and 95 and the Gilets jaunes. And, I think that's one of the reasons why social movements are so frequent in France and can often be so...
it's accepted. It's part of the culture.
It's part of the culture, part of the political culture. It's not outside the political culture. When Luc was little, he used to say, I'm going to organize a manif. He was so accustomed to manif. It was like,
And you've talked a lot about your love for France. So now I feel I'm allowed to ask you what you don't like. What bothers you in France?
Well, it used to be that the one thing that bothered me most, that most mystified me, and I used to say, Martha, we're leaving this country, was Johnny Hallyday. Because the cult...
You even wrote about that.
I wrote about that. Because Johnny Hallyday...
You call it the untranslatable French love for Johnny Hallyday.
You'll have to explain to me, someone will have to explain to me, and many, many French friends have tried to do it, because I've always thought, how can you...
I cannot explain, but I love it. Because je t'aime.
How can you, is this sad, for me, to an American, this sad Elvis imitator with a phony name and a phony line, but I never could get it with people with such exquisite taste as the French.
I think it was so good on stage.
Yes.
This is the thing, and it could relate, I don't know how, to people.
But listen, I love the French chanson tradition. I would take Charles Trenet over Noel Coward. I would take Charles Trenet over... Frank Sinatra. I would take Charles Aznavour over Tony Bennett. I love the French chanson tradition. Barbara is one of my favorites. I love French popular music. But I even love, and of course I love French jazz. But Johnny Hallyday has always baffled me. So that's one thing.
It's okay, you have to live it, you know. Sometimes there are things that cannot cross the Atlantic.
No, all my French, the women friends, when I say to them, explique-moi, Johnny Hallyday? And they all say, oh, Johnny, oh, Johnny. It's like, you just have to love him. The thing two things that I get exasperated with. One is the administration, is the pervasive bureaucracy and the struggle to escape the encumbering rules of bureaucratic administration, which do become exhausting. And America is horrible that way, but you get worn out by it.
By France.
By France. So that's exasperating. And of course I get, not exasperated, but depressed by French pessimism, by the pervasive French pessimism about France, about life, and about the future. I understand it, but it's sometimes hard to live with.
I feel we have so many great things in our country that if we had even 50% of the American enthusiasm, we would do amazing things.
I think that's true. And I know one part of it, and I sound here not like an American liberal, but like a French liberal, is entrepreneurial initiative is hard to get off the ground in France. You know, that perpetual story of the Minitel, the internet, right?
The way we invented the internet without marketing.
Yes, exactly. And that's something that if I were French, would still drive me crazy. And I know
don't worry, it drives us crazy.
And that's a real deficit, I think, in France. But apart from those two things, Martha and I have still the persistent fantasy that when I'm ready to, I'll never retire from writing, but I may be ready to write big books instead of countless essays. We'll go back to Paris, and our plan is to become an irascible old couple of the kind you see,
And you will be an American in Paris.
Forever. I've written countless essays, many kinds of books in my life, but I suspect that will be my epitaph, an American in Paris.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Adam. It was wonderful.
Thank you, Benedict. I truly enjoyed it.
So what were you doing on the Fête Nationale, on the 14th of July, on Bastille Day?
We've always loved it. My favorite memory of that is we would often go back to Paris in July, and we were in front of it must have been right on the field of the Invalides. And suddenly, and I swear to you, you looked up and the parachutists were coming down from the sky in their beautiful white uniforms and landing. In America, people would be pushed back for 6 blocks, right? And they were landing 5 feet away from the kids. My most beautiful memories is looking up in the sky, seeing all of these white flowers falling to earth.
The Thing About France is produced by the Cultural Services of the French Embassy in New York. Special thanks to Sixième Son for our music and to Force Majeure for our look and feel. For more information, visit thethingaboutfrance.com. Allez, c'est fini.